Okay, so we are recording now. Thank you all for being here today. My name is Jess Hagman. I'm one of the leaders of the CAQDAS group, the Qualitative Social Sciences and Humanities Data Interest Group of IASSIST. I'm joined by members of the Professional Development Committee from our group as well for this webinar on choosing an appropriate digital tool for qualitative or mixed methods analysis. We are excited to have with us today Christina Silver from the University of Surrey and director of the CAQDAS Networking Project. Just a quick note about IASSIST. We are the International Association for Social Science, Information Service, and Technology. We have folks from all over the world in academic, government, nonprofit, commercial organizations who work on issues related to data. If you're interested in becoming a member, it's just iassistdata.org. We have a very reasonable $60 fee, which there is a reduced fee for those who are in developing countries as well. So we invite you to join us. We have a really active group of, we have a great conference and people on our list who discuss everything related to data, both qualitative and non. A lot of our members right now have been actively involved in the Data Rescue Project, which, as many of you are probably aware, in the US, we're having a need to preserve US government and other public data. So datarescue.org is a place to find out more about that. All of the workshop recordings are going to be available on the IASSIST YouTube channel, which you can find. So this will be up probably within the next week or so. And we invite you to view those later and share them. And I'm realizing I don't have a slide, but I did want to let you know that we do also have an annual conference that will be online this year. I think the call for proposals should be out pretty soon on our website, and would love to hear from any of you who haven't been before. Having an online conference makes it easier for us to invite folks who aren't new folks in, and that'll be at the end of May or early June. So happy to answer any questions about that. And I believe, we do have one more workshop coming up in this series. In November, we'll be having Generative AI in QDA, introducing the Guided AI Thematic Analysis Framework from Ken Yen Trung, who will be presenting this. So the date is tricky for those of us like in the North America, South America. It is the 21st of November in Australia time at 12 p.m. In Central Time where I'm located. It's actually at 7 p.m. on November 20th, which is the Thursday, I believe. So when you register, you should get the Zoom link or the Zoom invitation in your time zone. But just to note that that one will be a little bit different in terms of, this is our first one from someone outside of either the UK or the US area. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to Christina. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks very much for that. Good to hear all the things that you are up to. I'm hoping that I have now shared the correct slides, and let me just move this out of the way so that I can see things properly. Okay, fabulous. So today I want to talk with you about digital tools for qualitative and mixed methods research, and I'm sure that many of you are aware that there are many of them. So therefore now we have to make some decisions about what to use, when to use them, how to use them, and whether to combine their use with a range of other tools that we have at our disposal. And so those are the things that I want to speak with you about today. Please do use the chat. I will keep my eyes on the chat as we go through the session. And if any questions come up that are timely to answer then and there, I will. But otherwise, we'll leave them to the end. There should be a good chunk of time towards the end to have a discussion. Okay, so what I'd like to do today is to use my experience over the last almost 30 years now, when I've been thinking about the role of digital tools in qualitative and mixed methods research, just to talk a little bit about the types of tools that we now have available, their role in our process, the breadth of options, which I think at the moment is very much mushrooming in the context of what's happening in the AI space. And then really after that sort of introduction, think about, okay, so how do we make appropriate choices within this breadth of possibility? And we're going to do that by focusing on both methodological and practical considerations. So first of all, of course, qualitative data. Typically, we think of text, which might be handwritten text or electronic text, but of course, other forms of qualitative data include still and moving images and audio. And these days, since we've had the internet, we have had so much more available qualitative data to incorporate into our studies and to integrate in various ways, maybe also with other forms of more quantitative materials at all. So that as well. So that's what I'm talking about, any kinds of qualitative material. And that might be data that you have collected or generated specifically for a study, or more naturally occurring materials that are available from archives or online or wherever. And in terms of tools, of course, we have a number of different types of tools. We have manual and digital tools. And so by manual tools, I mean things like highlighter pens, scissors, sticky notes, and so on. I'd love to hear in the chat if anyone's done qualitative analysis using those kinds of manual tools in the past. The first qualitative analysis I did back when I was at school, actually, I interviewed a few people. I typed up what they'd said to me, and then I printed off the transcripts, and I physically cut them up, and I got lots of different coloured pens, and I put all of the bits and pieces all over my table and my wall, I think, in order to manage and think about what was going on. And of course, we have digital tools, which is what I'm here primarily to talk about today. But with respect to digital tools, we have bespoke and more general purpose tools. So yeah, absolutely, Nina. Some colleagues call the manual approach the arts and crafts approach. And that really reflects, doesn't it, the tactile nature that we often as qualitative researchers like to have with our data. But if we're talking about digital tools, some digital tools are general purpose. So some of you may have used Microsoft Word or Excel or other digital tools to help with your qualitative analysis. They weren't designed for the purpose, but they can be used. But we have also more bespoke tools, so digital tools which are designed for the purpose of facilitating qualitative and mixed methods analysis. It's really important, I think, within that idea of the difference between manual and digital and bespoke and general purpose, to remember that, of course, it doesn't have to be either or. You don't need to make a choice necessarily for one project or within projects. You can use a mix of different tools, both manual and digital, and bespoke and general purpose. And I think many researchers I come across do mix and match different tools. So, for example, if you decide to use a bespoke qualitative analysis tool, which we're going to talk a little bit about more later on, NVivo, Taget, CAQDAS, Atlas TI, those are some of the examples of the bespoke digital tools. You don't have to sit behind a computer all the time. You can still print things off. You can still use those highlighter pens that you might be very fond of. It's just that you're using the digital tool to manage and store and give you access to everything. All right, so with that little bit of background, let's move on to concentrate on digital tools. Okay, so as I mentioned, those bespoke tools are what are broadly referred to as computer-assisted qualitative data analysis, or CAQDAS tools, and that is an acronym, CAQDAS, that was developed by the founders of the CAQDAS networking project, which I now direct, Nigel Fielding and Ray Lee, back in the late 1990s, came up with that term. And I think I'm going to say a little bit about terminology in a moment. but that's why I use that term, because I'm very closely involved with the CAQDAS networking project. Since the last few years, of course, we have seen generative AI capabilities come into those tools in a number of different ways. But not only are we seeing integrations of generative AI into CAQDAS packages, we're also seeing a plethora of new online apps that didn't exist a few years ago that are now purporting to be able to do qualitative analysis for us or with us using generative AI. So we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. And then also we have the general purpose AI tools. So I'd love to hear a yes or a no in the chat from all of you who are here today live about whether you've used AI chatbots like ChatGPT, Claude, Perplexity for any kind of qualitative tasks so far. Be very interested to hear if anyone wants to share that in the chat. Whilst you're doing that, I'll just move on and say, of course, we have to think very carefully, especially when we're considering using AI, what the role of those tools are in the analysis process. And so one way of thinking about that is to consider, are we wanting tools, whether they're AI or not, to assist us with our work or to replace some aspect of our qualitative or mixed methods analysis process that we either don't have time to do or can't do very well or don't want to do for some reason. So that's the kind of backdrop of some of the things that we're going to talk about. For me, in that acronym CAQDAS, the most important word is the word assisted. And when my colleagues came up with that acronym back in the day, they intentionally used assisted to talk about the idea that the tool isn't doing the analysis. We as humans are doing the analysis. We are responsible for the analysis. We're not passing that over to technology. And of course, in the era of AI, there are some blurring boundaries and different perspectives on that assistance aspect, which we'll touch upon a little bit more later on. But just to layer up that terminology, the CAQDAS acronym isn't the only way that researchers refer to the use of bespoke digital tools for qualitative analysis. Some just call them digital tools for qualitative analysis. Others use the acronym QADAS, Qualitative Data Analysis Software, which is a slightly shortened version of the same thing. So that's what we're talking about. You might be more familiar with the QADAS or digital tools phraseology, but the CAQDAS acronym refers to the same genre of digital tools. So often, especially those who are used to using what we heard in the chat earlier is sometimes referred to as a kind of arts and crafts manual tactile process. They wonder why we should bother with bespoke tools. Okay, we could use general purpose digital tools or manual tools. For me, the decision or the reason to use bespoke tools is all to do with access and the interconnectivity that access provides us. And so what I mean by that are four key things. One is access to materials. Once you're using a bespoke digital tool for qualitative analysis, you can have all of the materials that you're working with, whether it's the data that you're actually analyzing, or additionally, all of the supplementary materials that provide the contextual backdrop to your study. All of that can be within the same container that is your software project, and that's really, really useful. It means that you can get to all of those materials really easily because they're just inside one particular project file. Then we've got the idea of these programs giving us access to our ideas. So the process of doing qualitative and mixed methods analysis is a messy process. That's something that's been documented and discussed for many decades. When we have everything together in one place, we can also capture our ideas about what we're seeing and thinking as we're going through the analytic process, and not only capture those ideas either by writing or making little visual models and maps and so on, but those writing spaces and mapping spaces can be linked to the data that prompted those ideas. And for me, that was the game changer. That was the real reason why I first started becoming very interested in these tools and started to adopt them into my practice, because not only could I access my data really easily, I could access the ideas I'd had yesterday, last week, 3 months ago about those materials at the click of a button and build on them and develop them as part of the process. And the access to the process is the third aspect, actually. It's really, really important to document what we're doing, when we're doing it, how we're doing it. That's what we need to document if we're writing up our methods, and our methods are the way that we legitimize and illustrate that the work we've done has rigor, is of high quality. And so having everything in one place and using tools which are designed for the process makes the documentation process easier, and also means that we can show others what we're doing. And that's the fourth point, the access for others. It's not just about showing others what we've done from a rigor point of view, but also if we're working collaboratively with others, bespoke tools tends to facilitate that more easily than non-bespoke tools. We also want to be able to share our findings in concrete ways, and these kinds of bespoke tools facilitate that. And also sharing data. Many repositories are really keen to have analysed data as part of their bank of materials these days as well. So there's lots of different things that we can think about in terms of what we can access, when we can access it, and how everything is interconnected when we're using one of those bespoke tools. But as I said earlier, you don't have to only use those, of course. You have lots of choices of mixing and matching and combining the use of tools at different stages. But it's all to do with how we create and navigate those connections. So if you're interested in delving into this idea about access in a little bit more detail, there's a post that I wrote on my blog a while ago now, where I talk about all of these things in a little bit more detail, and I will share the slides later, so you can click on those links from the PDF of the slides and get to that if you'd like to do so. All right, before I go any further, I'd love to hear in the chat just which tools you've used before for your qualitative or mixed methods analysis. Have people been using bespoke tools like NVivo, MaxQDA, Deduce, or not so far? I'm not seeing anything coming up in the chat. Oh, here we go. Fabulous. Okay, so a few of you have been using some tools, some different ones. Nice to see a variety. Some of you have been struggling with some tools. Used Excel, but that was difficult. Okay, that's because of the lack of the interconnectivity that I was talking about before with Excel. You can sort things in Excel nicely, but looking how they relate to one another from a qualitative perspective is very, very difficult because it's not designed for that purpose. Great to see Taget mentioned here. That's an open source tool, which I'll talk about a little bit more later on. Unfortunately, Mac users tend to be less well served in this field. Historically, it's starting to change a little bit as we see more online applications, but yes. Okay, so nice to see that list. Here on my next slide are screenshots of, I think there are 42 last time I counted, and I know that I've missed a bunch off here, but these are the bespoke tools which are designed for qualitative and mixed methods analysis in some way or other. So we have lots and lots of choices beyond the ones that you may be familiar with, and that is increasing all the time. Every now and again, one or two of them drop off the map, that they're no longer supported, but there's always new ones coming into the space. And of course, almost 3 years ago now, When OpenAI released ChatGPT, then we saw things changing even more, and now we can definitely add a whole bunch of additional tools here. So Blix, Coloop, Free Text, Maze, Tailwind, MyRA, and a few others there are new tools that didn't exist 3 years ago, which are coming out of that generative AI space. So the point of this slide is just to emphasize how much choice we now have, more than we've ever had. Over the years, things have ebbed and flowed, of course, but we've got lots of different choices. But they're doing different things. They're not all synonymous or equivalent to one another. So that's why it's really important that we think about what our needs are when we're making a choice between tools. And I want to just go back a step before moving on to the detail of that decision-making process, just to remind you that the developmental impetus of tools is really important to bear in mind. So when this genre of qualitative software, CAQDAS packages, as I refer to them, first emerged, that was from the academic social sciences, so the middle of these contexts here on the slide, from the late or mid to late 1980s. But alongside that, we saw computational linguistics and text mining traditions also developing digital tools, software programs. And at the beginning, those three traditions were quite separate. So computational linguistics and natural language processing is all about looking at how language works, the form of language that might include coding, but looks at automating, focusing on parts of speech, nouns, pronouns, that sorts of things. Looking at why language works in the way it does. So, for example, why in English we say quick brown fox rather than brown quick fox. That's all to do with sort of linguistical characteristics of language. And text mining traditions really tap into the more quantitative content analysis traditions, also using natural language processing, but looking at large corpora of text for patterns of language from a kind of content perspective. And that was quite different, those two traditions, from the academic social sciences, where the tools that you mentioned in the chat earlier mainly come from, when we're working in more purist, qualitative, interpretivist spaces, and really interested in interpreting the meaning of qualitative materials. More recently, in the AI, or the generative AI at least, space, we've seen lots of new apps coming out of the market research space, and also government and policy research and evaluation is also an additional space where we're starting to see tools. So locating where you sit within or cross-cutting those different spaces is also important to consider. And that brings us on to the issue of categorizing these tools. And as social scientists, as qualitative researchers, I guess categorization is, that's essentially the core of what a lot of qualitative methods are doing. And that process of categorizing these available bespoke tools began really early on. So as early as 1990, we saw a textbook from Renata Tesch, who was the first person who started to categorize these software programs that were available at that time, who looked at categorizing them by distinguishing between whether the research interest was in the characteristics of language, the discovery of regularities, the comprehension of meaning, or in reflection. So that was one way of categorizing tools. Which I still find quite useful now, even though the tools have changed dramatically since then, of course. And then a few years later, Weitzman and Miles built on the work of Renata Tesch to create a taxonomy of qualitatively oriented software packages, as they referred to them at the time. And they distinguished between two broad categories: code-based theory building software and text retrievers and text-based managers. But a lot has changed since those early days of categorizing, but we still feel the need, many of us, to think about categorizing tools, especially when we have so much choice. And the CAQDAS networking project, which I now direct, we've been thinking about these issues for a long time, and we try to consider computer-assisted qualitative data analysis tools as really coming from that purist qualitative space, but maybe also having a whole bunch of tools that facilitate mixed and also quantitative data and analysis. So we would typically say that in order to be one of these bespoke qualitative tools, then the program needs to include some kind of content searching, some kind of qualitative coding, some ability to link, some ability to query, some ability to write and visualize, and some ability to map. It may not all of them include all of these things, but most of them will include several of them, and that's what distinguishes them from some of those other traditions. Now, so far I've been talking about tools, and that's what we're here mainly to do, but we don't use tools in a methodological vacuum. We are using tools to analyze our data through using an analytic method. And that really brings us into thinking about the kind of spectrum of methodology. And of course, we can map different analytic methods. There are many different analytic methods which are used to analyze qualitative materials. And they can be mapped along the methodological spectrum from the kind of purist qualitative spaces to the more positivist or post-positivist spaces. And so I don't want you to take this as gospel, this diagram. Every time I look at this, I think I could move the methods in different places. The point is that some methods, some analytic methods, are much more grounded in particular spaces in the methodological spectrum than others. And some may move along the spectrum a little bit. But mixed methods is, of course, sitting more in the middle, because in those kind of pluralist spaces, we are intentionally taking elements from the interpretivist and the more empiricist spaces in order to holistically understand our data from both of those philosophical standpoints. And I believe that we can also think about mapping tools in a similar way. Your choice of tools is driven by the data that you have, the research questions that you have, the analytic method that you're using, and that's what we're going to be thinking about a little bit more from now on. Okay, so lots of people say, well, what are the differences between all of those tools that I showed you the logos of earlier? Well, there are many differences. This is actually a list that I generated a long time ago, and I'm sure if I sat down, I could at least double, if not triple, the length of this list in terms of what's different between software programs. And these are all very specific things. And we could go through each of these, and I could tell you which program does what in respect to each of these things, but that would lead you to feel like this at the end of our session today, because that's a really high level of detail. And because we've got so much choice, I think it's much more useful now to have a higher level framing for thinking about what the differences are in order to inform those logical choices. So that's what I'm going to do with the rest of the time. So making an appropriate choice is all about being informed. And really what we want to do is to consider methodological aspects in that decision-making process and more practical considerations. So I'm going to start off with some of the methodological considerations. And I'm going to talk about data, analytic method, computer assistance, the nature and extent of, and interrogation and visualization when I talk about methodological considerations. And just to signpost what's coming later, in terms of when I get onto the practical considerations, I will say a few words about technical issues, team working issues, the learning curve that is involved, and the resources that are required. Before I continue, however, I want to just make it clear that in the time that we've got available, I can't possibly provide a systematic or full comparison of all of those tools. And in fact, because they're developing continually and really rapidly, what I say today may well not be true tomorrow anymore. Okay, so it's more about the idea of the things to consider. And so the purpose today really is to raise awareness of some of the differences, to get you thinking about what it is that you need to consider if you're in the position to make a choice, what that right choice will be for you, because the right choice for you is not necessarily going to be the same as it will be for somebody else. So the examples and illustrations I use are chosen to illustrate those points, and for those reasons only. All right, so let's talk about data in terms of our first methodological consideration. And I want to encourage you to think about the types of data that you're working with, the formats that those data are available in, and the amounts of data that you have. So sometimes we're working with one type of data only, or sometimes we're working with multiple types. Sometimes the formats that we have those data available in are more complex or more straightforward. And sometimes we're working with a small amount of data. That's more typical in the purest end of the methodological spectrum. Sometimes we're working with vast amounts of qualitative materials. So the type, the format, and the amount of data that you're working with, and how you want to integrate them, which is really important in the mixed methods context, of course, is really, really important. So in terms of type of data, some programs facilitate the analysis of text only. And here is an example of some of those. And again, this may change. They may incorporate others in the future. But if you're only working with text, then you could consider just going for a tool that focuses its attention on the analysis of text. These two on the right-hand side, F4 Analyze and Scrintle, they're slightly different in the sense that they allow the analysis of text, but via the transcription of audio and video, which they have kind of at their developmental heart. Some of you will be working with more than just text, I'm sure. And so there are, of course, many programs which are designed to facilitate the analysis of multiple data types. So text, audio, visual, still and moving. So not necessarily all of these programs facilitate all of the different types, but these are examples of programs that facilitate the analysis of more than one type of qualitative data, which is very useful for many of us. And then I want to talk about, in terms of my second methodological consideration, about methods. And I'm sure that many of you have seen this meme doing the rounds. I don't know if anyone has. It was doing the rounds about 5 years ago on social media, I think, and it's popped its head up again recently. And I was really, well, what's the word? I'm not very happy about this. I mean, I can see that it's a bit of fun, but it kind of characterizes qualitative and quantitative analysis in very kind of obvious and kind of out of date kind of ways, but also it completely misses the fact that we have mixed methods analysis going on as well. It's not an either or, and often combining data and analyses of data is really, really important. So I just want today just to say that the relevance of this is to do with thinking about the range of tools available to facilitate the range of data that we have, to facilitate the range of methods that we have, and to facilitate the range of tools that we have. It's not as simple as this kind of straightforward dichotomy that we see continually proliferated, not just on social media, but in some methods contexts as well. And I've never understood the paradigm wars personally. I mean, I'm a qualitative researcher, but not because I think quantitative research doesn't have a place, just because I prefer to work with qualitative data. So again, if you want to read more about my rant, I wrote a rant about this image a while ago. Anyway, that brings us on to methods. Okay, so some bespoke digital tools are designed to facilitate purist qualitative approaches to qualitative data. So these kinds of programs are not focusing on quantifying qualitative data in any way. They're really emphasizing the human interpretation and providing fairly straightforward tools that allow us to replicate what we might have done if we were working with pen and paper. And so a few screenshots here as examples. This is a screenshot of Delve, which has a nice way of visualizing and highlighting coded materials. Here we've got F4 Analyze, which is similar in many respects, but the difference here is that those little analytic notes that you might think about and take whilst you're reading your materials can be, if you want them to be, embedded in the transcript. So here, highlighted in this kind of light yellow color, is not the actual data, but are the notes that the researcher has made about the data at that point. So really integrating your analysis through that note-taking, memoing process, or annotating process, it might be called, from a methods perspective, into the data. And that's really powerful when reflexivity is at the heart of what you're wanting to do. Here we've got a screenshot from Elan, which is all around video analysis and really focusing on the annotations of videos. So here you can see what social researchers might call a transcript, but it's not presented in a kind of paragraph or even a sentence form because we're really through that annotation process, really getting down to the nitty-gritty of the structure of the language. And then here we have Transana, which back in the day when it was first released in the early 2000s, 2002, I think it was originally a video transcription tool and subsequently incorporated analytic tools over the course of its developmental history. But the fact that it was originally a transcription tool, you can really see through the way that it enables analysis. So this is an example. This is from a project that I did many years ago. In fact, that's me there. I know it was 18 years ago because I was pregnant with my son who turned 18 just a few weeks ago. And this was a project that we did looking at, this is before we had Zoom and other of the platforms that we're very familiar to using today. This was a kind of predecessor of that kind of technology when we did a project looking at whether the interaction between teachers and learners would be different if you were teaching and learning via this kind of video streaming online platform rather than in person. So here we've got multiple streams of video synchronized with multiple transcripts. And so that's really forefronting the transcript as the analytic vehicle through which we analyze the visual material. So those are some examples of the purist qualitative approaches. Then we have a whole bunch of programs which are designed to facilitate quantitative approaches to qualitative data. So, of course, if we're on the other end of the methodological spectrum, we can analyze qualitative data from a very different perspective. So working with much larger volumes of data and quantifying the content or the patterns within the language in one way or another. And here are a few examples of tools that are developed specifically to facilitate those sorts of approaches. And then, of course, if you're a mixed methods researcher, you're sitting more in the kind of pluralist space, then there are a number of programs that are designed to facilitate mixed approaches to qualitative data. So they may have originally developed from one or other end, but they now facilitate a more combined approach. So hopefully you can see there that thinking about what your method is and where that method sits in the kind of spectrum of methodologies is really, really important in terms of choice. Additionally, however, we do have some programs that were originally developed to facilitate one or more specific analytic approaches. Most of the previous ones I've mentioned are what I would call methodologically agnostic tools. So they're designed to be useful whether you're doing a thematic analysis or a discourse analysis or a qualitative content analysis. So they're trying to provide tools which are relevant to more than one analytic method. But there are a number of tools which are designed specifically for particular types or particular emphases of methods. And these are a few examples. QCA MAP, for example, is designed to facilitate qualitative content analysis as Philip Mehring sees it, as one example of that. All right, so I've alluded to the idea of computer assistance a few times already today. And of course, that is the space which has really started to rapidly evolve over the last few years. But I think it's worth remembering that we have had assistance for longer than the last 3 years since generative AI came into the space, because we've had supervised and unsupervised machine learning capabilities such as topic modeling and sentiment analysis and other things available in qualitative software programs for a number of decades, actually. It's just that the hype around computer assistance has increased exponentially in the last 3 years. So some programs have, from their outset or more latterly, incorporated analytic assistance. So I mentioned earlier that back in the day, in the late 1980s, up until about 1999, the programs in this genre weren't doing any analysis for us. We were doing all of the analysis. The software was just holding what we did so that we could access it in those ways I mentioned earlier. But as soon as we started to get to the turn of the century, 1999, I think, was the first time that one of these programs started to incorporate some form of machine learning within them. And now we're seeing that a lot more, of course. And that has been extended significantly by the rise of generative AI. So some of you mentioned in the chat, those of you that are here live today, that you'd used ChatGPT or similar tools. Some of you had, some of you hadn't, some of you were worried about it. So we're going to talk about a few of those issues now on. I'll ask you another question in the chat, actually. Who here today feels that they understand what large language models are in the context of what they might be able to do for qualitative analysis? Give me a yes or a no if you think you understand that. I'm getting some tentative I think so's, some definite no's, and a few yeses. Okay, so let me ask you another question then. Who thinks it's important to know what large language models are and how they work before you consider using them for qualitative analysis? I don't think, since I've asked this question many times over the last 3 years, I don't think I've ever had anyone say, no, I don't need to know what they are. Okay, so those of you who aren't sure, you definitely need to become more sure before you decide to use them or not. I'm not here today to give you all of the technical information about large language models. I haven't got time for that, and I'm also not the best person to do that. But you do need to understand it as much as possible before you decide whether it's going to be useful or not. And this link, when you get the slides, will take you to a web page hosted by the Financial Times, which provides a visual explainer of what large language models are and why the transformer is the technology that took that capability to the next level 3 years ago, when we saw OpenAI release ChatGPT and everything that stemmed from that moment. So what I want to do, rather than talk about the technicality, is to thank you very much for putting that link in the chat. Rather than talk about the technicality, today I want to talk about what that provides us potentially as qualitative and mixed methods researchers. So these are the 5 core capabilities afforded by large language models and the generative AI tools that derive from them. So first of all, the idea that we can generate stuff, so the generate in generative AI. So qualitative researchers can and are using these tools to get ideas for projects and to create data. Then we've got the converse capability. So those of you that have used ChatGPT or similar chatbots, and you've asked a question, you got a response, and then asked another question, you're having a conversation, if you like, you're having a dialogue, you're conversing via a very easy to use interface, and that technology can be used by qualitative researchers to ask questions directly about your data. Then we have the summarize capability. So large language models are good, not perfect, but they're good at taking a large amount of text and reducing it down, condensing it down based on its form, reducing it, and data reduction is something that is relevant to what many methods do when they analyze qualitative data. Then we've got the idea of converting. So I don't know, give me a yes or a no. Has anybody ever asked ChatGPT or similar to create an image? So you've written a prompt like, create an image of a donkey eating an ice cream or something silly like that. Okay, what you're doing when you do that is you're converting a text prompt into an image. Okay, so you're converting one thing into another, you're turning one thing into another. That capability in the qualitative space is more to do with converting audio or video into text, which is the transcription, the verbatim transcription of audio or video recordings, which has been available for a long time, but is now a lot better than it used to be as a result of generative AI. And then finally, labeling. So qualitative researchers typically call this coding, qualitative coding, very different from quantitative coding. But technically, that's a process of tagging and categorizing content. And large language models can be used in various different applications for that as well. So these are the capabilities afforded, but as researchers, we need to think, if we're considering using them, how we would use them throughout the qualitative research workflow. And so if we take a general qualitative workflow as comprising these different phases, we need to design our project. We may need to review the literature as part of that process. We may need to collect or generate materials to look at in our study, and then transcribe, familiarize, categorize, interrogate, and interpret are the core analytic phases, in my mind, of the qualitative research workflow, which is what I'm primarily talking about today. And then, of course, we have to communicate what this all means, what we've learned through our analysis to the wider world. And we can map those 5 capabilities I mentioned earlier, generate, converse, summarize, convert, and label, onto those broad stages of the qualitative workflow. And the most important thing I think about this diagram is not exactly where the lines go from and to on either side of this Sankey diagram. The most important thing to take away from this is that these 5 capabilities on the left have a potential role in more than one analytic phase on the right-hand side. And so that's why generative AI is having such a profound effect on how researchers are thinking about, and some, but not all, researchers are doing their qualitative research right now. Okay, so what this all means in terms of our focus today on tools, is that we have now seen, I believe, 4 genres of generative AI tool for qualitative and mixed methods analysis. So on the right-hand side here, we have general purpose tools like ChatGPT, Claude, and many others, okay, which are not designed to help us do qualitative analysis, but some researchers are using them for that purpose. On the other end, on the left-hand side of this visual, we've got bespoke in-house tools. So some research organizations, some universities, some governments or government departments are developing their own in-house generative AI tools, which are being used for various applications which are akin to or relate to qualitative analysis. Of course, nobody has access to those unless they work for those organizations or departments, but that is a growing trend that we're seeing. In the middle, we have the established QDA software programs, so Atlas TI, NVivo, Max QDA, many of those that you mentioned earlier, they are starting to integrate generative AI into their existing suite of tools. And then we've got these new online applications, of which there are dozens and dozens and dozens, many more than will survive the test of time, I'm sure. But there are many, many of them who are still now even new ones popping up that are facilitating qualitative analysis using purely generative AI capabilities. And so the big difference between those two in the middle is whether the generative AI capabilities are intersecting with other ways of working with qualitative materials or are standing on their own. And so I did a session earlier in the year, I can't remember when it was, June or July, when I talked about that in a lot of detail. And I showed an earlier version of this slide then. If you go back and look at that webinar, you'll see that this slide I'm showing you today has been added to significantly since then because the developments are changing all the time. Today, I'm not really here to talk about generative AI specifically. It's just one of the tools that I'm talking about. But this table, although it will probably be out of date tomorrow or next week, at least gives you a sense at this moment of the range of different established qualitative software programs that have started to incorporate generative AI. And on the right-hand side are just the 6 of the new online apps that I'm most familiar with. As I said earlier, there are many, many more. The most important thing, however, oops, press the wrong button. Here we go. The most important thing is that those new... Oh, my computer says I need to plug in. I thought I had plugged in. Hang on a sec. Sorry. Sorry about that. It's important I plug in, otherwise I'm going to disappear. Okay. Sorry, that was bad planning. I think that's going to be okay now. What was I saying? Yes. So in the new generative AI only apps, it's starting to change a little bit in some of them, but basically they weren't originally designed to do coding. Now, the idea of qualitative coding has been the bedrock of most methods for decades. Lots of different ways of generating codes and reasons for coding and what the codes represent and how we generate them and all that kind of stuff. But typically speaking, these new generative AI tools are not doing any coding, okay? And so that's really important for us when we're thinking about using tools to enact our methods, because that has been the bedrock of many methods for a long, long time. So this is why there's quite a lot of discussion happening at the moment in terms of what these new capabilities mean for how we go about doing our analysis. If you're interested, here's just a little bit of a timeline around when some of those new apps started to become available and when the established programs began integrating generative AI into their existing suite of tools. The next 2 slides I'm not actually going to talk about. They're really here just for you to refer to and think about after the session. But I get asked a lot of the time, you know, why would I bother buying a subscription to one of these bespoke tools when I can just use ChatGPT? And there are many reasons. And so I've created here for you a table, in fact, two tables, one which looks at the technical considerations and one which looks at the methodological considerations, comparing the difference between bespoke tools, which are any of those integrations, any of the tools on this slide, for example, with the more general purpose AI tools like ChatGPT, Claude, Copilot, and so on. For me, the main reason is that ChatGPT isn't designed for analysis purposes, and therefore it doesn't have any of the guardrails that we as researchers need, including data security and so on, which the bespoke tools are much better at handling. But also technically, bespoke tools are much less likely to hallucinate. I'm sure you've heard the term hallucination used in reference to large language models. There's lots of programming that's going on in the bespoke tools in order to reduce the likelihood of that happening, which of course is very important to us as researchers. All right, so I'm just going to move on and talk a little bit about our next methodological consideration, which I think is the last one, which is interrogations and visualizations. So although, as I've mentioned, coding is the kind of bedrock of what we do when we're thinking about categorizing our data in many analytic methods, although not all, we also want to look at how those codes occur in relation to one another, and we want to visualize that. So I would argue that in all qualitative and mixed methods, we are in the business of identifying patterns, relationships, and anomalies in our data. In qualitative research, we're really interested in anomalies. We're also maybe wanting to test theories and hypotheses if we're working deductively, which of course is possible in qualitative research. If we're working inductively, we want to use interrogations and visualizations to validate our interpretations. I would also argue that there's always a comparative element in every qualitative and mixed methods project. Those lines of comparison manifest themselves in many different ways, in many different places, but there is almost always, I can't really think of when there isn't some line of comparison that we're trying to make. And we want to represent connections within and between data. So that's what happens after that categorization process if we're using coding tools. So here's just a few illustrations of what that looks like in different programs. At the top right is a matrix, a code matrix in MaxQDA, when we've got codes down the side capturing discussion about different members or different people in one's lives, and then each column is a transcript from an interview, and we're getting some sense of frequency here. But behind each number in this cell is the qualitative data, so we can just retrieve that very, very easily. We've got something similar below right from QAQDAS, where we have that comparative element in two columns. So here we're comparing a number of codes related to breakfast, toast, fruit, cereal, etc. The bigger the circle next to the code, the more times it occurs. So it's visually showing us that as well as numerically, and we're comparing what the female participants are saying with the male participants. And then bottom left are some is a screenshot from Deduce, which is showing the frequency of code application according to different data files and in relation to different variables, socio-demographic variables that participants come to the study with. So those are just a few examples of some interrogations that you can do focused on both the qual and the quant in the mixed methods context. Mapping can look a little bit like this. So these are three different visualizations. Bottom left is what's called a network, actually, from Atlas TI. top right is a map from NVivo, and bottom right is a code map from Hyper Research. So this allows us to draw and visualize connections between the concepts that we're working with in our data. And that's similar but different to modeling. Modeling is much more automated. So here we have, from left to right, we have Leximancer, Iramatech, Leipzig Corpus Minor at the top, and WordStat at the bottom right. And these are models which are generated in a more semi-automated or semi-supervised machine learning type of way, picking out connections. Whereas the ones I showed you before in the maps are a bit more human invested, making the connections and visualizing the connections. So those are just my key things to think about in terms of methodological considerations. I want to make sure we've got plenty of time for discussion at the end. So I'm just going to move on now and talk about a few core practical considerations. So I'm going to refer to technical, team working, learning curve, resources, and also platform. So platform is really important, and I'm going to talk about platform first, actually. So some programs are Windows only. So if you're a Mac user, you can't use these programs unless you're using some kind of virtual machine on your Mac. Many programs now are cross-platform. So they are either exactly the same on Windows and Mac, or there is a Mac version which is not exactly the same as Windows. And then an increasing trend are online applications. And so we're seeing more and more of the new applications which are coming onto the field now tend to be online applications for a number of practical reasons. Not least, it's easier to collaborate in an online environment because multiple researchers just need to log into the same online space, and then they can work with the data at the same time as their co-workers, which is much easier in an online environment. So that might be a very practical consideration for some of you if you're working collaboratively. Just to layer that up a little bit then, some programs are single user programs, so the ones typically that you have to install on your computer rather than being online. These ones do enable the merging of single user projects. So me and a colleague, we may create a master project, copy it out, work on it separately, and then merge our work together incrementally at various points. But essentially we're working separately, but we're bringing our work together. And then there are other programs that, although they are essentially single user programs, they have multi-user or cloud versions that you can use alongside. Some of you who work collaboratively might be in the situation when you have access to, or you're very familiar with, one program and your co-worker, maybe at a different institution, wants to use or can only use a different program. And that's historically been a big issue in this field, which a project that I was involved in a number of years ago, the slides have gone a bit wonky here, a number of years ago, called the Rotterdam Exchange Format Initiative, was a project that gathered together a number of the developers of these programs to try to come up with an exchange format that meant that you could exchange analyzed data from one program to another. So on the right-hand side here, 7 of these programs were involved in establishing that standard. They were Deduce, Quirkos, QDA Minor, Transana, Atlas TI, and NVivo. And the others there that you can see, Target, Deduce, F4 Analyze, Leipzig Corpus Minor, they have subsequently implemented the exchange format. So you can now exchange analyze data between all of those programs. And additionally, a number of qualitative data archives or repositories are now accepting analyzed data via that REFI exchange format. So that's significantly impacted the ability to collaborate when people are working with different platforms. So that's the first practical consideration. Then, of course, we've got resources. And so I want to talk about time and cost. Let's talk about cost first of all. We do have free and open source CAQDAS packages, and also Lite versions, which are free versions of the full version that just have a smaller set of capabilities. And this is a growing movement, which is really great to see because it really opens up accessibility. For me, it's not just about cash. It's also about the principle of having free and open source programs, which is really important in some contexts and some places in the world. Not all of the free programs are also open source. Here are some open source programs. Open source programs are free, but free programs are not necessarily open source. Then we've got the learning curve. So some of these programs are much more sophisticated, have many more capabilities, of course, and therefore it does take some time to learn to use the software. And so therefore, if you're also learning the method, learning to be a researcher at the same time as learning a tool, that's an additional burden. But in my experience, many new researchers and students are really keen to learn the tools as well as the methods, even though not all of the professors and lecturers want to teach them the tools. But I think we'll see what's happening now in the AI space, moving that even more. All right, let me finish up then and think a little bit about all of this. There are, of course, a number of pros and cons with respect to those methodological considerations and the practical considerations that I've been through today. So it's really, really important, not for me to say what the pros and cons are of each program. That's related to what your priorities are. And so I would suggest if you're in the situation of thinking about, okay, I need to make a choice, how am I going to make the choice? You first of all create a list of what you'd like to have, what you'd like to be able to do, and then sort that list, prioritize that list in terms of what you can't do without, what do you definitely need, and use that to base your decision on, because there will be some things that you will need to compromise on. So knowing what you're prepared to compromise on, even though you'd really like to have them, no one tool will do everything that you need it to do, probably. So you may need to combine tools or make some compromises. To facilitate that, we have got quite a lot now, and it's an increasing list of reviews on our website. These are completely independent reviews, and they are largely written in a comparative way, so that if you read one and then read another one, you've got the same or as similar as possible, depending on the software capabilities, as similar as possible section, so that you can make direct comparisons. I would also encourage you to talk to your colleagues, seek others' opinions, trial programs, and see, sometimes it's just about the environment that you feel most familiar or comfortable in, as much as the actual capability itself. And so I guess just to finish up with some key messages that I hope have come through today, there is no best digital tool or CAQDAS package. And so it's really important that you think about what you need. Colleagues, I said you should talk to colleagues and definitely listen to what your colleagues say. They have useful things to impart if they've used some of these tools, but their favourites are not necessarily what you need to use for your project. So don't base your decision on what your colleagues have found to be the most useful themselves, because that might not tie up with what you would find to be the most useful. Some of you may be in the situation when you're constrained by choice. Maybe the institution you work in has already got a site license and it's not possible for whatever reason for you to go with some other tool. Almost certainly you'll be able to make the tool that you have available to you work for you. But that doesn't mean it's not useful to know what else is out there. I do believe that knowing what else is out there allows you to think about what you're using yourself and make that more of a conscious and reflective decision. So think about your methodological context, think about your specific analytic needs, think about the kinds and amounts of data that you have that you need to analyze, think about whether you're working individually or part of a team, think about whether there's a package and peer support already available where you are, and if not, how much budget do you have and what platform are you working on? Think about the amount of time you have to learn. So the free open source software programs, because they are free and open source, they tend to be more limited in terms of their capability, so therefore much easier and quicker to use and learn. And how do you prefer working? What's, sometimes people just feel more comfortable in one environment, one software platform than another, and that can be a really relevant, useful decision. Okay, thank you very much for listening. I'm really interested to hear what your questions are. There are a few references here that I alluded to earlier, but you'll get the slides later. So I think I'll just stop my share so that I can see you all a bit more easily. And I don't know if I saw any questions in the chat that I didn't speak to, but happy to take any questions that you have now. Are there any questions? I'm happy for people to open their audio and speak if you don't want to write in the chat. I've got a quiet group, Jess. Maybe I've overwhelmed them all.
There's a lot to think about.
Yeah.
I guess I'll ask a question. I wonder when, like, if you're having conversations with people in like a short-term context, like if you have any, someone who's not going to like read this whole sort of conversation or these slides, like this is obviously very useful, but if there's anything you like prioritize when you're talking to people in like a shorter context, or if someone asks you, what's the best tool? Like, obviously there is no best tool, but like what kind of things do you bring up first?
Research questions and data. So what is it what data have you got and what are you trying to get out of it? So the research questions suggest to us what the method is going to be. So, nicely crafted research questions suggest what is a useful method. And then you've got that whole, is it purist qual, or is it a bit more mixed, or is it a bit more quant? And then you can kind of, then that would be my main starting point, that when I consult with people about, okay, this is my project, this is what, and I always say, okay, what do you want to do and why do you want to do it and how do you want to do it? And then we can whittle it down. Well, this could do it, that could do it, and then you get to a smaller. And that's a real problem at the moment. I think, even 10 years ago, there were fewer programs, so the choice was less overwhelming. And definitely in the last 10 years, it's really kind of mushroomed significantly.
Looks like there's a question in the chat now.
There is a question in the chat. Is there any tool that can run locally for collaborative work on the same project? That's a big challenge for my research group. Okay, so I think that question is there a tool that multiple researchers can work on the same data at the same time that's not an online tool?
Yeah.
And so then you have, yeah, is that right? Is it you, Denise?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so there was a slide back. When you get the PDF of the slides later, there is a slide that shows you it's programs that have multi-user or server versions. So NVivo, for example, has a server version. So if you and I were working together, Denise, I'd have NVivo on my computer, you'd have NVivo on your computer, but we'd have our project located on a server. So it's not completely offline, but it's on a server that nobody else has access to. So it's those kind of multi-user programs that work in that way.
Do you know, of any tools that is free that does something similar? Because I worked with NVivo for a long time. Of course, it's always the license are quite expensive usually.
Yeah. So some of the free programs do enable collaboration, but they tend to be online programs. Jess, can you think one off the top of your head, a free program that does offline collaboration? I'll have to think about that.
So Taget will let you install on your own server that you have control over.
Yeah.
So I think that might be, it would be functioning like it was online. It would look exactly the same. But that would be a good option. I also saw someone mentioned earlier in the comments, Libra QDA.
Libra QDA, that's online though, isn't it?
It looked like it was
Is it?
based on Taget, and I was just looking to see if maybe they have like you can install because it looks like it's similar to Get. So I guess I would maybe investigate both of those options in
Yeah.
terms of seeing
Yeah.
if they would work for you.
Perfect. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Well, people are maybe typing things in. I'm just, as a housekeeping note, if you, obviously you all registered, I will email everyone who registered to make sure you have the link to the slides and the YouTube recording once we have that available. So you'll get an email from me probably within the next week or so. Kate, I'm actually wondering, do you want to stop the recording? Or I guess I can probably do that too in case anyone wants to ask a question that's not on the recording. I'm going to go ahead and stop that.